Diet is responsible for more disease and death than physical inactivity, smoking and alcohol combined.
Cardiovascular disease is still the number one killer. So the biggest killer in the world has been confronted with one of the biggest medications in the world, and it hasn't slowed down. In fact, it's gotten worse.
The main pathophysiological process behind heart disease is insulin resistance. And there's no pill that is effectively targeting insulin resistance.
During my career, we used large data. We were finding lots of trends that were not being echoed in mainstream medicine.
Medicine itself is not an exact science. It's not like physics or chemistry. It's constantly evolving. And in fact, 50% of what you learn in medical school will turn out to be either outdated or dead wrong within 5 years of your graduation.
You're kidding me.
This is how extraordinary and crazy this health misinformation mess is. When I was working on calls in the hospital, I was like, the food that was available wasn't the most nutritious. There's definitely something going wrong with the food environment here. We've got this obesity epidemic, but we're selling junk food in the hospital grounds. That doesn't make any sense.
More than 50% of Americans right now pre-diabetic. What would you say are the suggested steps that they follow to get out of it?
So if we go back to square one, and this may surprise a lot of people.
You are in for a real treat. This guest, Dr. Aseem Malhotra, is a board-certified cardiologist, a world-renowned cardiologist. He's an author. He's a huge advocate of dietary and lifestyle changes, but he's also published clinical research and written numerous papers in the British Medical Journal and all kinds of other published journals. And this podcast was one of my favorite podcasts because we just got real, visceral, and raw about the corruption in our medical system, very often in our randomized clinical trials, and about what lifestyle choices you could make to completely change your trajectory to cardiovascular risk. In other words, if you have cardiovascular risk factors in your family, high blood pressure runs in your family, high cholesterol runs in your family, and you're worried and you don't want to go on statin therapy or you don't want to go on conventional therapy, this is the podcast for you. Please pay attention. Get a pen and paper out. I love this I loved it so much that when we were done the podcast, I did a short podcast with him afterwards because the post-podcast talk was so good. So enjoy this podcast, guys, and remember, it's just science. Hey guys, welcome back to the Ultimate Human Podcast. I'm your host, human biologist Gary Brecka, where we go down the road of everything anti-aging, biohacking, longevity, and everything in between. And today I have a very special guest on the podcast. I know I say that all the time, but this is an incredibly special guest, Dr. Aseem Malhotra. And Dr. Aseem is a world-renowned cardiologist, an author, a huge advocate of lifestyle medicine. And I'm really, really excited to run this podcast. In fact, when my team gave me the talent research on you, I said, no need. I've got this. I've watched his Rogan podcast. I've watched his documentary. I can't wait for you guys to listen to this podcast. I can't wait for it myself. We did an entire podcast in the kitchen before we even came into the podcast room. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Malhotra.
Gary, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to be here with you too. Interestingly, I got a call a few months ago from a good friend of mine in the UK, Dr. We call him Dr. E, Dr. Moignat. And he and I have been friends for years. And he is like, Gary, have you heard of Dr. Malhotra? And I said, that name sounds familiar. He's like, you got to check this guy out. You got to have him on your podcast. He speaks your language. I mean, he's right up your alley. And so I went down the rabbit hole of everything Dr. Aseem. And I got to say, man, I'm extraordinarily impressed with your background, the fight that you've been on for humanity, your willingness to actually stand up and be criticized in the public square for going against the mainstream. And I really would recommend every single person listening to this podcast, I'm going to put a link to it in the notes below. Watch Do No Farm. That's PHARM, the documentary that he put together. It's all in layman's terms. It is absolutely eye-opening. I watched it once, listened to it a second time while I was driving. Fascinating documentary. It will actually lay the foundation for you for what is causing the chronic disease pandemic in this country. And I thought it was fascinating. Your Rogan podcast was also excellent. I listened to that whole podcast, so I'm really excited to get going with you today. I often start my podcast because with a similar theme, and I think that you fit this theme because I feel like a lot of the most impactful people in the world, the most passionate, the most purpose-driven people in the world that are following their calling, are doing so because they solved a real problem in their life. They had a real issue. There was some tipping point, loss of a loved one, they overcame addiction, they solved the health crisis that they were having on their own, and now they're out serving humanity the way that you were, the way that you are. What was it, if any, was a tipping point in your life, that aha moment as a practicing cardiologist, as a traditionally trained allopathic physician, that made you open your eyes and say, wait a minute?
Yeah, it's a great question, Gary. I think there's probably been a number of events that have happened in my life that have shaped me in my journey, not just one. A few key ones that come to mind certainly was when I was 11 years old, my older brother, who was 13, he got viral myocarditis. He just had a tummy bug. And within 6 days, he went into crashing heart failure and died. So that was initially, that was quite a big event for our family. You know, my parents were both doctors, almost helpless to do anything for him. And that was my initial interest, certainly, in wanting to think about pursuing a career in cardiology. And then, you know, as things evolved over time...
Goosebumps, man. Wow. That's incredible.
I mean, you know, my brother had Down syndrome as well. And I think, you know, everything for me comes back to basic human values and about compassion for other people. And because both my parents were doctors, that was kind of almost a culture within our household that my primary duty in life was to help others or do something for the community. And of course, looking through the health lens, that's ultimately why I decided to pursue a career in medicine. But I was most fascinated with cardiology, probably because of my brother's death. And as that evolved for me as a doctor, having qualified in 2001 from Edinburgh Medical School in Scotland, and then subspecializing in cardiology and then interventional cardiology, I was noticing more and more patients coming in with chronic disease. We're giving them more pills, more pressure on the system, noticing my colleagues in the National Health Service feeling more stressed out. And I'm somebody that can think ahead and analyze things quite quickly. And I once I realized, I saw a pattern, I thought, if this continues down the same trajectory, we're going to get into a situation where our healthcare systems are going to collapse. And we might even be in a situation where we won't even be able to provide timely care for acutely ill patients. And that the worst scenario of that, and we'll come back to, you know, my initial journey and my epiphany moments, ultimately culminated in my father, who suffered an unexpected cardiac arrest in the summer of 2021.
Wow.
And despite
he was a doctor.
He was a doctor. And despite the fact it was witnessed with two doctors doing CPR on him and calling 999 in the UK, I know it's 911.
Yeah.
And expecting, while I was on the phone, the ambulance to turn up in 8 minutes, for him to be defibrillated because he was in the best potential situation to survive. And the ambulance took 30 minutes and he died.
Wow.
And that was a reflection ultimately, and I investigated it and I wrote about it and it became a big news story. But effectively the healthcare system, was under so much pressure that the ambulance crews were not meeting targets for treating heart attacks. Wow. So, I never expected that to happen, but to come back, certainly I think one of the key moments for me when I got involved in the public sphere as a activist in terms of improving public health and tackling obesity was, I remember in the summer of 2010, a patient came in the middle of the night. I was working as a cardiology registrar, so I was essentially the one below the top tier in the hierarchy of being cardiologists, trained in intervention, heart stents, for example. And I was on call. A patient comes in his 50s, acute heart attack. We treat him with emergency stenting. He, I go back to bed. I was on call, right? Next morning, I'm doing the ward round and I'm giving him advice on the pills we're going to put him on, blood thinners, a statin. Telling him about following a healthy lifestyle.
Right.
And while I'm talking to him about healthy lifestyle, the hospital serves him a burger and fries. And he looks at me and he says, "Doctor, how do you expect me to change my lifestyle if you're serving me the same crap," pardon my language,
wow,
that likely brought me in here in the first place? And for me, I just thought, this is just crazy. I was looking around in the hospital. I mean, I think a lot of it.
Yes, people. Here we have around 7 episodes. I will translate this for you, my fellow Thai people. There is a time it is now to wake up. The doctor have not do anything wrong, any country, because the rich pharmaceutical industry have a very hard grip on the doctors. And you will see this doctor now. He will be extremely famous because he are strong enough to show people what is wrong with the medical system in the world. This is a warrior, because a doctor, he have house, car, and a clinic, mostly. If he do any wrong, they're shutting down the doctor and take everything away from him. And that is so wrong it can be. So we have to understand what the industry are doing to our society. We need to clean out the criminal people running the world today. And I'm very proud of this doctor that have courage enough, because now he have Gary Brecka, and Gary Brecka have become a very rich man because he going against the system, and he have a system that healing people in a naturally way, like me in the superhuman protocol. And I will only tell you one thing, people. This will come more and more people now out and talk the truth about the system. So there is very important that you take your time and listen to this, so you can understand this good, what going on. Because there is many things between the line we don't understand here. The pandemic was a complete scam, like the food pyramid was a complete scam. When the tobacco industry start go into the food business, they already have medicine, so they make people addicted for cigarette. So they have putting that over to the food industry, so they make people addicted, like McDonald's, KFC, all the another thing. So that is what I want to show you, people. And I'm very happy this coming now, because now you can wake up and you can understand. So when you go with your daughter or your mother or your father to a doctor, you have to go and see the side effect of the medicine, my dear fellow Thai citizen. Please take the work, do the research about the medicine, see the side effect. You will learn so much that you will be shocked. Have a good day, people. This is the first episode of 7 episodes. Have a good day, my fellow Thai people.